Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 100 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. I am here with Gavin and Fia, and Gavin, you would think this would be a wonderful time for us. Podcast episode 100.
Yeah, it sure would be.
However, Gavin, what's it like for you right now as being the only one of the three of us that can eat solid foods? How are you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good. A brand new Pokemon game just came out, so I've been playing a lot of that, and really enjoying it. But apparently, I've been the only one of the three of us enjoying myself over the last couple days.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So I can't speak for Fia exactly what's going on, but like I had a rough night last night. I won't go into details, but like both ends, and you can fill in the blanks from there. So, and I'm still not feeling good. So we'll just see what happens on this episode. But you know, podcast number 100. This is perfect.
Tis the season.
Yup.
I was with some of my boyfriend's nieces this weekend, and they had a little cold sickness thing going on, and I think that I have stumbled my way into also catching that.
Ugh.
Yay, germs.
That's rough.
Yep. Oh yeah, it's great stuff.
I know it's now that I work at a college, I have to worry about all of those kinds of things. Because I remember when I was in college, I would, something would just like sweep through campus. Everybody you know is sick at roughly the same time.
Yep.
Luckily, I don't actually deal with students all that often, but I can only assume that like the first or second week of classes next semester, I'm definitely going to get sick.
Yeah, it's probably a safe bet.
But yeah, so we had to skip last week because this was a really big topic and I wanted to do it right. So I did not give myself enough time. And so we put it off this last week. But now we're back this week talking about the history of paleontology, but not the stuff that you might have heard from paleontology classes or even previously on this podcast. But before we get into that, Fia, give us some housekeeping.
Yes, of course. So don't forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to, and to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube to give us feedback about the show and any future topics you would like to hear on the podcast. And if you'd like to be a guest on the show, please be sure to fill out our guest form, and all of these things can be found in the show notes below. So, Gavin, what is going to be our episode topic for next week?
Well, next week, we have some news actually about next week.
Oh, yeah.
That's a really good point, Mike. Excellent segue. So something that the three of us have talked about, off recording is the podcast is going to be a little much to try and fit in some of our schedules. So we have decided to, instead of doing every week like we have been doing for 100 episodes, we're going to switch to an every other week schedule. So that just fits better in all of our lives. It gives us a lot more flexibility in when we get to record because for the most part, I would say at least 90 to 95 of these episodes have been recorded either 1 or 2 days before the episode goes out, which is just not great for anybody because then we're always in a rush. So this gives us much more flexibility to be able to record it when it's actually best for everybody instead of when we have to. Plus, it gives us a little more time to work on some other stuff. For example, I'm going to be putting up some more things on YouTube. Generally, maybe one thing a month extra on YouTube, just for fun, as well as actually giving me a little more time to do things with the podcast social media, which I've been greatly neglecting. So going forward, episode 101 will be not next week, but the week after. And in that episode, we'll be talking about the continent of Australia, which I'm pretty excited about. Australia's pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
So do you guys have any other thoughts on the schedule shift?
Yeah, I mean, just having been here since the beginning, we obviously wanted this to be kind of as often as possible. And we got functionally 100 episodes or very close to it on a weekly schedule. And I think this is just kind of what works best for us now. Nothing more, nothing less. This is just kind of what works best for us. Now that we are, almost, what has it been, 2 or 3 years? Are we almost
pretty close to 2 years?
Yeah, coming up on our 2-year anniversary.
Wow.
So that's all this is. Nothing crazy. Just a change in schedule.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it will lead to better content for the podcast in general.
Yeah, I agree. There are some different editing things that I want to learn how to do, but just haven't ever had the time because, for the most part, like I said, I'm either recording and editing in the same day or recording on Monday and then editing Tuesday night. So I only have maybe a couple hours to do the editing, which has been fine, has been definitely adequate. But maybe I want to flare things up every now and then. So
Nice.
either way, same old content, just going to be twice a month instead of 4 times a month. So with that nice housekeeping out of the way, do you have a today in history for us, Mike?
I do. So kind of fitting in with the theme of us not feeling well. November 23rd in 1991 was the day that Freddie Mercury confirmed to the world that he had AIDS. And I always found that interesting that was happening, or that was confirmed the day before he died. So a statement gets put up.
Oh, really?
A statement gets put up by his representatives, because rumors had been kind of swirling around.
Yeah.
For a little bit. So he said, "Yep, I have, I have AIDS. We're going to do everything we can to fight this, etc., etc." And then about 24 hours later, he was dead.
Wow.
And yeah, just a a casualty of his time in both the acceptance of people in the LGBTQ plus community, being able to openly be who they are, as well as the progression of drugs, for the HIV/AIDS virus. So yeah, Freddie Mercury, an absolute legend. In 1991, on this day, announced he had AIDS, and on tomorrow, the 24th, was when he officially died.
See, I even watched the movie, and I didn't think I knew that it was back-to-back days like that. I don't remember how they exactly handled it in the movie. But
it really frustrated me with the movie. They call it Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yep.
That really frustrated me because you cannot tell the story of Freddie Mercury without talking about his death. And if I'm remembering correctly, the movie basically stops with that Live Aid appearance. And
there might be some text afterward, but yeah, pretty much.
Right, I believe there's some text, but there's no actual movie part to it. So that really frustrated me with the with the Freddie Mercury movie. And so yeah, I'll give him his due here on the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Mike.
Yeah.
Now swapping over to Swamp Corner. What do you got for you?
Yeah, so this is a short one today because, as I found out, there's not much information about this little guy. But it's something that I just recently found as a new species in my community samples for my master's project, and that is the large-scaled spiny cheek sleeper. The scientific name is Eleotris amblyopsis. It is a smallish fish that is geographically present in the southeast U.S., Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean, and along much of the east coast of South America. This species of sleeper is amphidromous, which means that it travels between fresh and salt water, but not for breeding purposes. It just does. So, that's kind of cool. It can obviously tolerate a wide range of salinity. These guys are carnivorous and feed on fish and crustaceans, although I also saw another paper that mentioned that this species and a few relative species feed on hyacinth roots, which I thought was a bit strange.
Yeah.
So that's my little guy. The other thing is that I forgot that I said a while ago that I was going to start doing nature dad jokes, and I just keep forgetting every single week. So here we are. But I did find one very quickly. And I'll leave you guys with this. Why doesn't the sun need to go to college? Because it has 1,000,000 degrees. Well, millions of degrees.
I like it.
Well done.
All right. Thank you for that, Fia. And on to our main topic, the history of paleontology. Also, big shout out to my wife, Liz. She's the one who kind of recommended this topic to me. And when we talk about the history of paleontology, we mostly talk about events that take place more or less after 1700. With very, very few exceptions. This includes things like the Bone Wars, episode 6. Mike is chuckling because that was a very fun episode for us.
It was a very fun episode for me, at least.
Mm-hmm. And for example, the word paleontology was not a thing. It was first published in 1822.
Wow.
Very recent in terms of a lot of the other sciences.
Definitely.
And the word dinosaur wasn't even created until 1841. So not even 200 years ago. So most of the focus on paleontology is relatively recent, all things considered. Some other benchmarks in there is that Darwin published his famous book On the Origin of Species in 1859. And this sort of period of paleontological research called the Dinosaur Renaissance, when we, started to visualizing dinosaurs much more like we do today as like big active predators instead of just giant lumbering dumb lizards. That was roughly in the late 60s through the 80s, like 1960s through 80s. So not even, 50, 60, 70 years ago. So most of things that we talk about are very recent. And a very quick pop quiz for Mike and Fia. What are some things that were generally happening in the world in the 17 and 1800s?
Cholera.
Yep, that's true. Not what I had in mind, but yes. I'm sure it's on your mind right now.
Yeah, right now it's exactly what's on my mind. 17 and 1800s, I mean, there was that revolution. There was a couple of them, actually.
There sure was. Fia, any thoughts?
Yeah, I really let Mike have this one. History is not for me.
the
there was
thing
a
that
lot of
I
stuff
had
going
in
on.
mind.
Can I get a
Yes.
hint? Put me in the right direction here.
Mostly Europe doing things to other countries or other parts
colonialism.
of the world.
Oh, they were going through and just like ripping apart the rest of the whole planet.
Absolutely. The major period of European colonialism, particularly of the Americas and Africa, and also lots of parts of Asia as well, happened in the 17 and 1800s. And this becomes a very big factor when talking about the history of paleontology, because, like I said, that's roughly when paleontology was getting its start, because people were going to other places and taking their things and discovering all this neat stuff.
Yeah.
And bringing it back to wherever they were from. And even if you Google just history of paleontology and go to the Wikipedia page for that, it only has like 3 paragraphs for pre-1600 paleontology. And almost all of that talks about the 1500s. So before 1500, it's not like fossils didn't exist and that people didn't notice them. A lot of it just didn't get written down, which is super unfortunate. And there are thousands and thousands of resources that already exist for you to find information about the things in the 1600s and 1500s. So let's talk about the history of fossils other than what you might learn through just a quick casual Google search. And let's start off with a couple of definitions here. So what even is paleontology? I'm sure we defined it in like episode 1, but as I've mentioned, the early episodes are kind of cringy. Don't go listen. So what would you guys call paleontology?
Just the study of the past living things.
Study of the remains of previously living things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's pretty much right. It's basically just the scientific study of past life, whether it's things like footprints, whether it's things like fossilized poop, or even what you think of as fossils, which are bones and clamshells and things like that. This is a very sort of Eurocentric thought, as most things in science kind of tend to be. So in the strictest sense, the scientific study of paleontology wasn't a thing until scientific practices were being used. So in the strictest sense, what we're going to be talking about today is not paleontology per se, but that doesn't mean people weren't looking at and observing and learning things from fossils for history before this. And then one last definition is a cool word that I ran into that I had never heard before doing some of this research, called geomythology.
Ooh. What's that?
Yeah. As somebody who's a big mythology nerd, I grew up loving Percy Jackson. I know pretty much all the Greek myths about various things. But this geomythology was a term created by Dorothy Vitaliano in 1968. And it's basically the study of myths concerning geological features and events that may refer to verifiable geological phenomena.
That's cool.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. So it's basically all of the myths and legends associated with various geological things. For example, one we're not going to really talk about here is Devil's Tower in Wyoming is a giant column of rock that just juts, hundreds and hundreds of feet above the, plains of eastern Wyoming. And, lots of native peoples had various myths and legends about what that is. Most of them usually viewed it as some kind of giant tree, because if you look at it, it does kind of look like a tree stump, just one that happens to be hundreds of feet in the air. So that kind of thing is geomythology. So that's going to be a good part about what we're talking about today, because I think that that's a really interesting intersection of the physical geology science as well as some like anthropology stuff.
Yeah, I've never heard of this before.
Yeah, and it kind of makes sense, so, sort of like urban legends almost. So it's like if you have this giant rock nearby, there are probably some kind of local stories that you tell each other, especially like as your kids, right, or something about the rock. So we're going to be sort of going around the world talking about geomythology of some different places. So we'll start in some of the places where there's less information, unfortunately, about what the native peoples there were doing. Starting with Australia, I found almost nothing about what indigenous Australians were doing and like their relationship to fossils. For example, when I Googled like a direct Google of fossils in native Australian culture, the first thing that came up on Google was a page on the forum called Answers in Genesis, which is a creationist forum.
Not what you're looking for?
No, not quite. The page asked if native Australians coexisted with dinosaurs. That was the question, like the title of that page on that forum.
Oh, dear.
Which the answer is no, by the way, other than birds. So yeah, that's pretty much all I got for Australians. Sorry, any listeners down under. If you know anything, please tweet us or comment it on our YouTube. Because I genuinely, because there must have been some kind of interaction, obviously, because it's not like Australia doesn't have fossils. They have a lot less of them. For example, they have a lot of fossils that are relatively recent. So most of these stories from other parts of the world are based off of bones that look nothing like what they currently have in the area. Whereas Australia, they don't have as much of that. All their fossils tend to be much more recent.
Yeah.
So most of Australia's fossils are also invertebrates, the ones that are a little older. The vast majority of vertebrate fossils are recent enough that the very first native Australians that got there probably interacted with those animals. Just because they're extinct, the native Australians may have had a part in that. So less interesting stories to tell, about animals that you can still go see, So, and just for a little bit of context, there are only 23 known species of dinosaur from the entire continent. Spoilers for next episode. And several are only known from like just a couple of bones.
Okay.
Is that like, was Australia, is this back in like Pangea days, or was Australia, already kind of off to itself, making it less likely for dinosaurs to get there?
Yeah, no, Australia was a part of Pangea, just like every other major landmass, but it's not that the dinosaurs weren't there. It's that the rocks these days are not good dinosaur rocks. They're not quite the right age, most of them.
Okay, but so the dinosaurs in Pangea were at the same time. That was just what I wanted to make sure of.
Yep.
Okay.
So, sadly, just those couple of minutes about Australia. Moving on, we'll go to Africa, where there also isn't all that much evidence, unfortunately. And this is for a variety of reasons. Africa is an extremely culturally diverse continent. And so pretty much everything that I'm going to say here about Africa is a vast generalization.
Okay.
Also, pretty much for the entire rest of the episode, everything I say is going to be very generalized. So don't, unless I mention like a specific group of people, don't think that everybody on whatever continent was doing this. General, white person talking about other cultures disclaimer. And so in Africa, as well as in the Americas, because this becomes relevant in a little bit too, written language was not as much of a historical thing as it was in places like Europe and Asia. So, you think back, all the way back to, the pre-Greek cultures in Europe and the very northern parts of Africa. They had written language, all the way going back like 5,000-6,000 years ago, or even things like Egypt. They had written language 6,000 years ago. And in other parts of Africa and in the Americas, that wasn't really the case. So it's much harder to have records of things if they don't write it down.
True.
Or at least, draw it in various things, which is actually convenient because there are actually some cave drawings in Africa that are, give some details about these kinds of things. Most of them come from places like archaeological sites, like places where the cave drawings would tend to be. And they tend to be just kind of strange objects that is like somebody found a fossil, thought it was neat, picked it up and carried it with them for a while, and was now found at an archaeological site where that fossil couldn't have been. Like the rocks are not the right age, or even the right kind of rock. That's a big part of it in lots of places in Africa. So, for example, if you found, this neat fossil skull or this fossil tooth, you just were like, oh, that's neat. I'm going to pick it up and put it in my pocket. Like, I would do that if I found like a neat rock on like while I'm hiking. I would just pick it up, put it in my pocket. And then later, if I made camp somewhere and forgot it, that's the kind of thing that happens a lot in these African archaeological sites with fossils. And I learned a new word with this one as well. Those are called manuports.
Oh, cool.
Because you pick it up and port it with you. However, like I said, there are also some things like cave drawings in Lesotho, which is in sort of the central Atlantic coast of Africa, as well as some of the southern African regions where there are drawings of giant birds and giant bird footprints. However, these drawings in these caves are not far away from known dinosaur trackways.
That's pretty cool.
Wait, so dinosaur footprint, trackways?
Yeah, so places where, there are no dinosaur bones or anything, but, the fossilized footprints, like they walked across like some wet sand or something, and then some sand got put over it, and it sort of preserved like a cast of their, footprints. And people in this area saw, these big, three-toed footprints, and particularly in the area around Lesotho, the native cultures there are like very well known for like their tracking ability while they're hunting, and so they notice these footprints look a lot like big bird footprints, but just giant. So they're like, so there must have been giant birds somewhere. So they were making observations and then relating it to the things that they have today, which I think is really neat.
Right, given the information they had at the time, that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they were not there. They just only saw the footprints. Okay.
Right.
That's cool.
Yeah. And then just as a fun example, there is somebody in South Africa, I believe, who was found using a fossil. They didn't specify what kind of fossil, but using a fossil as a pot lid in 1830.
How did someone record that?
I don't know. I found several websites that like cited that, but again, they didn't cite what the fossil was or who found them using it or anything like that. So take that one with a grain of salt. But that's presumably, as we'll talk about when we get into some other areas, people would often associate various fossil things with cooking, and that they would be, like symbols of, different fossils could be symbols of different things. And if you use this one in your cooking, it'll, give you more energy. If you use this one in something related to cooking, it will, give you good gut health.
Whoa.
Timely subtweet.
That was a good one, Gavin. That was good. It's not good. My gut.
Yeah, that's true. So, yeah, it's interesting.
It's almost,
like I said, they're not.
It's almost like giving like herbalism type of vibes, but there's more research done on herbalism than there is on putting fossils in your soup.
Right. I feel like this falls more in the vein of like crystal healing.
Yeah. Okay. That's better. That's better.
Again, not trying to disparage other, people's cultural norms, but I don't think cooking with a fossil as your pot lid is really going to do too much for you.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's pretty much all I was able to find, from not incredibly sketchy sources about fossil use and observations in Africa, pre-colonialism. So moving on, we have much more information about the Americas, especially North America, because by the time that, the United States was progressively moving west, quote unquote modern science was already kind of a thing. So when they would talk to, new Native American peoples that they encountered, they would talk to them and, would ask them about fossils, because especially in times like the Bone Wars, people would use local Native American guides to guide them to the fossils, and the Native American people would know where they are because they were somewhat culturally important to them. And then as Americans tend to do, they just ripped it out from underneath them and took it back to a museum on the East Coast.
Oh, jeez.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. So, unfortunately, like I said with Africa, South America doesn't have all that much information about it. South America, while it has lots of fossils, they're not as common as in North America. So depending on where you lived, if you lived in, the year 1000 or so in South America, depending on where you lived, you might have never encountered a fossil ever. And also in the Americas, written language was not as culturally significant as it is in other places. So, but from what I was able to see, most things that apply to North America also kind of apply to South America. Again, big sweeping generalization there, but and most of this information, particularly about North America, comes from a really amazing book that I've read a bunch of excerpts from. It's been on my Amazon cart forever. I just know I don't have time to read right now, so I haven't bought it. But it's a book called Fossil Legends of the First Americans by Adrienne Mayer. And so she basically went around to lots of different Native American cultures and nations today. And basically everything we're doing in this episode, just ask them, hey, what do you know about fossils? How have your people used fossils in the past, and that kind of thing. So this is just a giant collection of this kind of, geomythology stuff.
Wow.
So super interesting book that I definitely will be reading at some point. Maybe I'll ask it for
And
Christmas.
the author did this only in America?
Including Canada,
Oh, okay,
I think,
cool.
as well. And then I think there are a couple sections that talk about South America, but I think there's just less information to go
Yeah.
on.
That's fair.
Yeah. But North American peoples have been documented finding and using fossils for thousands of years. There are things all over like national park websites about it. Finding things like jewelry made out of various different kinds of fossils is very common, particularly out west in places like the Dakotas, New Mexico, Colorado, places like that.
So I'm getting a bit confused here about people using fossils as like tools, as opposed to just people using bones as tools. Would that be the same thing, or is that different?
Pretty similar, generally. Fossils are generally harder than most non-fossilized bone because it's, chemically it is rock instead of bones, which are just
I
hard.
see.
But people were observant enough to realize, hey, this looks like a bone that I found in this deer that I just hunted, but it's hard. Maybe I can use it for other stuff. Or sometimes, for example, in one that is sort of plastered on the front page of, I don't remember which national park website this was on, but there was a necklace made out of the little discs of crinoids. So crinoids are sometimes called sea lilies. They're related to things like starfish and like sea urchins. So they make their bodies out of these segments. And in crinoids, they have this big, long, like stem that comes up from the seafloor to the tentacles that sort of filter in the water column. And their stem is made out of these little, like, circular discs stacked on top of each other. That when the animal dies, they break apart because they're not super well held together. And they also tend to be a little hollow on the inside. So almost like a ring.
Okay.
But more solid, but it has a hole in the middle like that. And so it's pretty common in places like Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, that sort of area, to see necklaces made out of those with just a string strung through the middle of them. Almost looks like a candy necklace.
Cool.
Yeah. And it's harder to tell, like I said, because written language, so it's harder to tell what all these native groups thought about fossils because they didn't write it down. What they thought about fossils at the time, but through a lot of their legends and stuff and different stories that they would tell, it's interesting to see people from one area where there are lots of, for example, marine reptiles from when the dinosaurs were around, have legends of giant sea monsters and things. That's a very common thing around like the Dakotas and Kansas and in places like that. Yeah. So it's like we can tell that this is a really big thing that kind of, looks like it lived in the water. And we definitely don't have it today. Must have been some giant monster thing.
So default is anything that they found was just a monster?
Or they would just sort of, well, I mean, if you didn't know what it was, if you say, you lived in Kansas, for example, where the biggest thing that you've ever seen is a bison, and most other things, pretty much everything that you see around you in terms of animals are mammals. And this thing looks absolutely, you find these giant skeletons in the ground and with these big sharp teeth and it doesn't look like anything you've ever seen before. I would probably call that a monster as well.
Yeah, me too.
And circling back to the not writing stuff down as much, Even these days, some native cultures think it's kind of insulting to write down their stories that have been passed on just like orally over generations, because it's sort of thought that the humanity of the person telling the story is what gives the story its life and its meaning. So writing those kinds of different stories down is not something that they do.
Wow.
And also on top of that, some native groups just don't want to share or publish some of their oral stories because they are theirs. That's what they have of their culture, because the rest has been stripped away from them, which I get. I get that. I wouldn't want to either. I'd feel some kind of way about that.
That's fair.
And despite this general lack of written historical record keeping, we do know that various native groups speculated about the history of fossils just like everyone else around the world did. It's kind of impossible to go through what every native culture thought, as there were differences from nation to nation, obviously. And no source specifically really said that, like, the Mohawk people of New York thought this about their fossils. The Lakota people thought this. The Choctaw thought that. So again, lots of generalizations here. Mostly across the West, fossils were sort of actively sought out. So people would, they'd send out groups just like they would to go hunting, but they would send out groups specifically looking for fossils, which I didn't know before this, and I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
In different, places, fossils were used. And it's complicated because a lot of native cultures don't see like land as something you can own, quote unquote. But sometimes they would use fossils for various purposes, like sort of deeds to land, where it's like, hey, I got this thing from this land. This is where we do our stuff over here. You can't do your stuff over there. They would use fossils in making some of their weapons. Like they would use them as like hilts for like some kind of knife or spear points, things like that. And as I mentioned before, some things like medicines, they would cook food with fossils and get some kind of effect from that. And jewelry, things like the necklaces. Including something that is really important in pretty much every Native American culture is beads. Beads of different colors, made of different things, have a lot of different like ceremonial purposes for Native American cultures. And lots of different kinds of beads were made out of fossils that would mean different things.
Yeah.
Especially in Western regions that have rocks from the Mesozoic era, so the time when the dinosaurs were, when giant reptiles, other than dinosaurs as well, were around. Local native cultures recognized that fossils were bones of giant creatures that were no longer around. We already kind of talked about that kind of thing, but they would speculate on their appearance and their behavior, and even why they are no longer around. They wouldn't just think, hey, there must be these things around here, but we haven't seen them. No, they'd recognize that these things used to be here, but are now not, which is really interesting to me, because the concept of extinction did not occur to like European scientists until the late 1600s at the earliest.
And so
Because go ahead.
For reference, when is this time that you're talking about across the West?
It's tough to say.
Okay.
I think they would just, I don't really know.
1600s is what you're saying?
For like the when extinction became like not even like accepted, but just a concept that people thought about in like European cultures. Because in a lot of European cultures that were mostly Christian, God made the world as it is.
I see.
And things are as they always have been. So things going extinct was not even something that they thought could happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like the Bible isn't a science textbook. Oh, I said that.
Oh, what do you know? But yeah, so they had these thoughts about, again, not only that they are no longer here, but why are they no longer here? And they depicted these giant cataclysmic events, which we now kind of know also happened. Things like the extinction of the dinosaurs, big rock hits Earth. Granted, they didn't realize that kind of thing could happen per se. But they came to the concept of extinctions, even sort of mass extinctions, much quicker than, like European scientists did, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, they're getting into their deep thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. on the sort of the flip side, some cultures believe that it was kind of improper to remove bones from the ground, and in some cases compared digging for fossils to cutting your own mother open and removing bones from her body, which I think is a
That seems excessive.
Yeah, it's kind of extreme. But like, again, depending on your culture's view of, nature and the earth,
True.
I could see how they get to that conclusion.
Yeah.
Also, sorry, Mom. I removed many a bone from the ground.
Your
Sorry.
mom would be like disentangled and like disemboweled by now.
Oh, yeah. And while in the groups that would take fossils from the ground, they would make detailed observations about the fossils and their differences or similarities to their own local animals and even plants. So they were basically comparing the fossils to everything else that they have around today. They recognized that these were once living things, which, again, even took European scientists a really long time to actually figure out that fossils were not just weird-shaped rocks, that they were the remains of animals and plants. So again, and comparing cultures is tough, but I just like to point that kind of thing out, that people outside of Europe were not just living in the Stone Age until Europeans got there.
Sure. Preach.
Many cultures came to conclusions that were then integrated into their sort of folklore and mythology based on these observations and comparisons to their local animals. For example, some plants looked kind of different than their local plants, so they figured for example, this area must have been more foresty in the past because we see these big fossil trees instead of the grassland that we have now. Spoilers, they were right. And they would incorporate that into their legends, and they would tell stories about why it is no longer a forest here. And their legends might not have been, correct. It might be some, spiritual thing instead of just, drying climates, getting rid of forests and replacing them with grasslands. But they made observations and then came up with things to explain them, which is basically what we do in science. They just had a much more spiritual bend to them.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, reading all the stuff about the Native American folks was really interesting. I wish that I could have gone more in depth in some of the other places, but there just wasn't as much information.
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, getting into Eurasia, because I don't know why they're generally considered different continents, because they're the same landmass and kind of always have been. But here we are. So, as well as, not only have the two continents been together, their people share a lot of things, especially when it comes to their mythology. A very common thing you'll hear about early European and Asian cultures is how they understood fossils is through their mythology. And these are things that most people would properly call mythology, Greek mythology, ancient Chinese mythology, Egyptian mythology. Not that that's in Europe, but it's pretty European influenced. Famous examples are things like the giants and cyclopses of Greek and Roman mythology, and also lots of other parts of Eurasia. And there is quite a lot of evidence that these myths are inspired not only by just having really large bones. If you find just a large femur, you'd be like, well, that's a big bone. It must have came from a big person. But something that really helps with that is the really distinctive skulls of proboscideans, which are elephants and their cousins.
Oh.
In proboscidean skulls, there is a single large opening at the front of the skull in the middle. And that hole is for muscles to attach that control the trunk. However, if you're looking for a pattern and you see that, the skull otherwise kind of looks human-ish if you don't know anatomy, And so they would see the single hole in the front and be like, oh, there must have been a one-eyed giant human out there at some point.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Cyclopses, that is kind of like the go-to example of various things, even to the point where, various Greek legends would point to like this island in the Mediterranean where it's like this giant who has a name that they would give a name to in their mythology lives on this island and fought this hero and whatever. And later paleontologists and archaeologists would get there and they would find bones of proboscideans on that island. So clearly some like sailor went there and saw these giant things, these skulls that they thought were just from a giant person, and would basically come back and be like, oh, Jason is my favorite, mythology person. He definitely came to this island and slew this giant. Because I like him and I like to tell stories. So that was, things like that were later shown with examples of how they might have been influenced by mythology.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah. So another one of Europe's most famous pieces of mythology is unicorns. And unicorns probably get their origin from people from one part of Europe traveling to other parts of the world and seeing animals with different horns than the ones that they were used to. For example, like someone in Europe going to Africa and seeing rhinos and then going back to Europe and telling their friends about it. Pictures didn't exist at the time, so they couldn't have taken a picture. So they were like, man, I swore I saw this horse thing with a big horn on its face.
I've always wondered how unicorns came to be, because I didn't know what horses could have had horns like that. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense that like back in the day when they didn't have pictures and they could just describe something, how that would come to be.
Yeah. And this one isn't as much fossils because with things like rhinos, their horns don't preserve because they're not made out of bone. There's no bone in them. But it very well could also be some kind of deer-like thing that they found fossils of that had different horns on its face than the deer you're used to. Or maybe just like a single strain. Maybe there was, this is a little bit of a stretch, but like a single, individual whose horns grew wrong, so that they only grew one and it grew in a strange place. Something like that.
Right.
But the main reason I include unicorns in this is because that potentially also includes mammoth ivory in different parts of Europe. There's a drawing in an early 1700s German medical book, and the drawing is titled Unicornum verum in Latin, which is true unicorn horn, is what that means. However, the drawing is very clearly just a mammoth tusk. Like it is curved exactly like you would expect a mammoth tusk to be, and based on there's also some drawings of like people in that drawing as well, and based on the rough size comparison, yeah, it's almost certainly just a mammoth tusk.
That's hilarious.
Another big part of Eurasian lore across the entire, both continents, are dragons. Dragons are everywhere. And this one also fairly self-explanatory. Even though there are pretty big differences in how different cultures depict dragons. In Europe, they tend to be the more four-legged, just lizard with wings. Whereas in Asia, they tend to be much longer, more serpentine-looking dragons, but large reptilian things, which very commonly are likely associated with people finding dinosaur skeletons or other large reptile skeletons.
Oh, okay.
But in some cases, were just other extinct animals. For example, there was a German doctor wrote up a paper titled Dragon Skulls in the Carpathians, which is the mountain range that runs through like Romania, where Dracula is supposed to be from. And the detailed drawing that he had in that paper is very clearly a cave bear skull. Yeah. So just because it's not a dinosaur doesn't mean people didn't think that it was a dragon.
Why were all of these doctors out there just describing animals?
That's a really common sort of question when you start looking into like the history of science in general.
Yeah.
Most doctors tended to be rich people.
Okay.
Because they could afford to be educated in things and study anatomy. is the big thing. So when you study vertebrate anatomy, you need, lots of
Right.
lots of samples. And so a big part of early paleontology was doctors, because they were just known as like the science person.
Yeah.
So when regular people would find something, they would bring it to this physician, who, because they know anatomy, would be able to tell certain things about it. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. In various parts of Asia, different bones of all sorts of animals, even ones relatively mundane, such as like ancient species of deer, were seen as various forms of dragon bones and used in traditional medicines and that kind of thing that we talked about earlier. And lastly, to round some things off and make Fia a little happy, fossil invertebrates
Yay.
are also a big part of Eurasian fossil lore. For example, fossil sea urchins were seen as eggs of things like dragons or other large reptilian things.
That's funny.
Sea urchins, you think of as like this big like ball of spines. The
Yep.
spines are actually really loosely attached to the main body. So when they die, usually the spines will fall off. It is very rare to have a fossil sea urchin with the spines.
Mhm.
So most of the time you just have the ball that is the main body of the animal. And to the people who don't know, if you live in like Central Europe where there's not an ocean near you, you don't know what a sea urchin is.
Yeah.
And so they just saw it as like this lumpy ball, and they thought that those were a dragon or other kind of like serpent eggs.
Even for me, like for a long time when I was a kid, like you could find sea biscuits on the shore, and those are
Mm-hmm.
just like the skeleton of a sea urchin, but like all their spiny stuff is like gone. So you just see like
Yeah.
this round little thing, and you're like, I think it took me several years to figure out that like that was a sea urchin.
Yeah.
It's very misleading.
Mm-hmm. In some other places, and I have no idea how this got started, because the sea urchins as eggs I can kind of see,
Yeah.
but this one, this must have just been like a coincidence one time that just somebody ran with. In other places, sea urchins are supposedly dropped from the sky with lightning. So I don't know if there was just like a lightning strike and then somebody went and checked it out later and found like a sea urchin fossil.
Whoa.
And people would find sea urchin fossils and carry them around with them to avoid being struck by lightning, because lightning never strikes the same place twice.
Okay.
Yeah. So I have no idea how long that lightning never strikes the same place twice thing has been around, but clearly quite a while.
Yeah.
As I mentioned before, the discs of little crinoids, the things that made up the stem, in different places around Central Europe, were seen as the money that was used by fairies, because they look like little coins, but they're so
cute.
small. So people would be like, "Oh, this is the pocket change of a little fairy,"
Oh.
In some places like England, where ammonites, which we've previously called swirly-shelled squid boys, they're related to squids and octopus and things like that, but they have like spiraled shells. And part of their, lore was that they were seen as petrified snakes that curled themselves up, and that's why they're spiraled.
Oh dear.
Yeah, in some places, sculptors would actually carve a snake's head into the fossil to try to like restore it, which is really interesting.
Also kind of
Yeah.
sad for like current paleontology if they needed those fossils.
Yeah, but especially in England, ammonites are a dime a dozen. They're very common over there.
That's fair.
And those are just some examples that I thought were neat. Obviously, everything in this episode, there is much more to talk about in each of these places. I'm positive that if I had, the proper connections to talk to, I could find some stuff about how, native peoples in Australia used fossils or thought about fossils. But unfortunately, there's only so many hours in a day for me to be able to look for that kind of thing. So,
Well, this was
with
a really
all of
great
this
episode, though.
said, Yeah, I'm really excited about it. I thought this was a really neat episode to talk about and to do for episode 100. I thought it was really neat.
Right.
Fossils have such a wonderful history, other than the stuff that you hear about in academic circles. Like even through all of the paleontology or other, related classes that I've taken throughout undergrad and grad school, I think the earliest, like we might have mentioned one or two things by like Aristotle, because anything with science kind of starts with Aristotle. But it's like that's the earliest we got, and then pretty much everything else until like 1800 was focused just on Europe.
Okay.
And I thought it would be neat to look around. Also, big shout out to my wife Liz. She's the one who kind of recommended this topic to me. So
Yeah.
I might
Liz.
edit this to make that at the beginning.
Sounds good.
But yeah, so she was like, hey, maybe you do this for an episode. I don't remember if she's suggested it specifically for episode 100. But yeah, I think more knowledge should be shared about these different, fossil knowledges and fossil traditions in places around the world should be shared more. So hopefully you all thought this episode was as neat as we did.
Yeah.
And yeah, we will see you in 2 weeks for episode 101 about Australia.
I am Fia, and that has been Gavin and Mike, and we will see you guys all at our next episode.
This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Finella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.